Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 3, Paris, Medieval and Modern, of a long civilization's trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands, by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 15, Number 3, April 1937. A Long Civilization's Trail, by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note: this is the third episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. Paris, Medieval and Modern. Here is a charm about Paris that is part imaginary and part actual. Many Americans think of Paris as synonymous with Europe, and their first trip abroad is centered in and about Paris. Actually, however, Paris differs only slightly from many of the other great cities of Europe. Of course, its customs, language, and historical background are different. But in reality, there is little more of interest to the traveler or even to the tourist than one would find in London, Berlin, or Rome, for example. France, it is said, is a nation that desires to live in the past, in the glory of past achievements and accomplishments, the romantic settings of previous centuries, to dwell upon her great personalities of yore, and thus she turns reluctantly to the present and to the future. It has also been said that the average Frenchman devotes himself to the things of the day and to modern affairs by necessity, but prefers living in the memories and glory of the France of the past. And since France has been a battleground for centuries, and a prize which various powers of Europe at different times sought, the French people are instinctively on their guard, and one gathers the impression that many of them are suspicious. They are constantly, it seems, on the alert for those who would take advantage of them. This suspicion affronts many visitors, though the effrontery is unintentional on the part of the Frenchman. This suspicion is manifest in national affairs. It casts a burden on her industry, finance, and full cooperation with other powers. Time after time, France has been trampled upon, her national honor insulted, her people enslaved, her institutions destroyed by the greed and avarice of hostile powers. And each member of a family has taken an unexpressed oath that it shall never happen again. And this obligation colors their views. France is therefore a militaristic nation, not because of a desire to conquer or even to expand herself, but for self-defense alone. She feels that if she can command the greatest air force and one of the best equipped and manned armies in Europe, as well as having the most extensive fortifications, she will be safe from the crushing blow which she feels other powers are waiting to give her to further their own ends. The people as a whole are extremely emotional, but this emotionalism is not evidenced except in emergencies, in crises. There are other peoples of Europe as emotional, and they display their emotion more frequently in the commonplace affairs of the day. The average Frenchman is quiet, peace-loving, even tempered, except when extraordinarily provoked. Then the emotions, like pent-up furies, break loose, and perforce they sweep away the usual, very logical reasoning of the people. The impression the visitor gets is that Paris is a city of two classes only: those who are wealthy or at least have a very substantial income and are able to enjoy the better and finer things of life, the luxuries, and a great multitude who are struggling along, barely able to provide the necessities of life. There does not seem to be that dominant class which we in America say is the great middle class or the bourgeoisie. This is particularly noticeable in the material aspects of the city. On the great boulevards we find every evidence of wealth and prosperity: large buildings with marble and tile fronts and chromium plating, modernistic lighting effects and decorations, broad streets and sidewalks, shops displaying articles of every conceivable type, exquisite jewelry, clothes, both men's and women's, of the latest fashion, rare perfumes, gems, restaurants and cafes whose cuisine caters to the Epicurean. The passers-by cure well-dressed, alert, cultured, refined, but if one steps off the boulevard, in many of the side streets he finds squalor, dust and dirt, congestion, old buildings with old plumbing and electric light fixtures, crowds, suggestions of poverty or at least want. There is not the same sparkle of life and hope in the faces one sees. There is more of an indication of drudgery and life without the light of culture. Of course, there are many sections of Paris which have beautiful apartment houses and private homes, but these again represent the opposite class, the other extreme. There is apparently no intermediate class, or at least a dearth of it. One is also impressed by the comparatively few Frenchmen that speak English, or in fact any other language than French. This is noticeable in contrast to London, Berlin and Rome, for the people of those cities almost all speak another language in addition to their own. It is not that Frenchmen cannot be linguists, because many of them speak several languages, but the Frenchman has an exceptional pride in his language, a traditional pride. And many feel it beneath their national dignity to express themselves in any other language than their own, except when obliged to by commercial reasons or some other equal necessity. Thus we find that in the French colonies, the mandated territories of France, the Frenchman does not make it his business to learn the language of the native, but attempts to oblige the native to learn French. England, on the other hand, takes a distinctly different position. She feels it is her duty and obligation to become thoroughly conversant with the language of the people of her colonies, and every public servant is obliged to do so. Thus we find that England has a better understanding, generally speaking, of the problems of the peoples of her colonies than has France. We had arrived in Paris early in the afternoon. The day was bright and warm, the sort of a day one looks forward to experiencing in Paris. We loaded our luggage in 3 taxis, and I might add that in the last few years, Paris has done away with her traditional taxis, which seemed like relics of the past, and has adopted a style of taxi which is more like the American one than any others to be found in Europe, and we're soon on our way. Visitors to Paris 5 years ago know it was the custom for taxicabs to have mounted on them the early type rubber bulb horn in addition to their modern electric horns. Taxis were forbidden to operate their electric horns within the city limits, and were consequently obliged to continually blow the bulb horn at least 2 or 3 times in each block, and each one had a different pitch or note. At first the visitor would find it amusing, and finally extremely annoying and irritating. With the increase of motor cars and taxis, the noise became a menace and finally was done away with. Actually, the visitor senses a quietude which is unnatural for Paris. After a short winding trip through the streets of Paris from the Gare de Lyon, then along the Rue de Rivoli, we pulled up at our hotel opposite the famous Tuileries Gardens, which were palace grounds for centuries and now form a beautiful park. The balance of that day and part of the next day were to be free. We were to devote them to our own interests before we began again filming historical sites and continuing interviews with officials of the Rosicrucian Order and allied organizations in Paris. We hurried from our rooms after arranging our luggage and decided at the curb that we would visit the majestic Notre Dame Cathedral on the little island in the Seine River, which flows through the heart of Paris. As we rode toward the Seine, I recalled how this little island in the heart of Paris, according to traditional history, was at one time all there was to Paris. That the Roman generals in their accounts to Rome, when they occupied France, told of a tribe of people, barbarians, who lived on the island in the Seine. Then again I thought of that medieval philosopher Abelard, who had numerous controversies with the Roman Church during the 11th century, and who, because of his advanced ideas, jeopardized his life, and how he went to Paris to study logic and rhetoric, and finally his teacher, William of Champeaux, admitted to him that he could teach him no more. Abelard then established his own school, and it is said that from the nucleus of his school, which he also established on the island of the Seine, later went forth students who took part in what later was the establishment of the famed Oxford University. It is said that everything we see, every scene or place or thing, leaves a color impression on our minds, suggests either 2 or 3 pronounced colors combination of them, that aside from the details of the thing, we have a memory of it in color, that it suggests color or light shading to us aside from its form. We all agreed that the grey stone walls along the Seine with their ponts or bridges of stone which have been there for several centuries, and the other stone, grey, cold, uninviting buildings on either side gave us an impression not of form particularly, but of just black and white. We later seemed to have the memory impression of our experience as darkness with just patches of light, representing the blue sky and the sun's rays which found their way between the mass of buildings and walls and were reflected on the muddy waters of the Seine. Man's works are mighty when they can instill within him the same feeling of awe as do the great things of nature. The Notre Dame Cathedral does that. Its great height, rising hundreds of feet over the Seine, the massive stones, the height of the center nave, the diffused lighting caused by the beautiful stained glass windows, the great flagging, the grotesque gargoyles looking as though they were leering down at you, leave one feeling small, insignificant. And yet the greatness of the structure, the stability and beauty of it, causes one to realize that with all that we are able to accomplish today, we cannot greatly improve upon this beautiful example of Gothic architecture. When one realizes that this great edifice was built without the use of steel or girders, and that the great arches, reaching from the central columns of the nave to the side wall, are all of stone, and the only thing which prevents the walls from crumbling under the tremendous pressure of these arches which press against them are the flying buttresses or oblique, separate outer walls supporting the inner ones, one marvels at the ingenuity of these early builders. Everywhere there are in this great edifice suggestions of wealth, power, and strength. The early church had need of such lavish display, for strung about these great cathedrals in Europe in the Middle Ages were the squalid shacks, one might call them, of the populace. In them, people led a sordid life. Gloom, dirt, filth, fear, and superstition existed in them. The average person's clothes were not much more than just what were necessary to cover his body. There was nothing that represented beauty. People had no beautiful furniture or jewels or paintings. They had no musical instruments except a few of the very crudest kind. Everything in life was dull and uninspiring. Life itself seemed to be hardly worth living. There was nothing that could awaken within people who lived at that time an appreciation of the magnificence of God, of the beauty and splendor of the things which He had created. Naturally, before they could appreciate the divine, they had to realize something which suggested by its very nature and difference from their ordinary life, that it was divine. Therefore, the church, collecting the pennies, the coppers, the sous of these people, was able to build in their midst a temple of such splendor and magnificence and majesty as depicted the God to which it was devoted. And on religious holidays, or when the people gathered in these big temples for worship, they truly felt that they were in a sacred sanctum of God, for the world of the church was so different from theirs. There was beautiful music like they never heard elsewhere, magnificent paintings and murals like they could not see anywhere else. There was a structure, stable, strong, representing eternity and the reliability and dependability of God Himself, in contrast to their frail structures which were like unto the life of man. And so, though we may condemn on the one hand the early church for taking the few miserable coins that these people had and using them to build such lavish structures, yet these received in return more spiritual benefit and more of an awakening of their inner natures through that means than they could have through the expending of their pennies, their coppers, in any other way. So we can say that the church was justified in its expenditures for these beautiful cathedrals. The hour was late before we returned to our hotel, and we were glad to retire. The next day was not so pleasant a one. The skies were leaden, and the smoke of the city was more visible against them than the day before. There was a slow rain, one that seemed ceaseless, and it had a depressing effect upon the mood. However, we determined to visit another historical site. This was the so-called Temple of Justice on the opposite side of the Seine. Again, we set out in a taxi. The taxi is the most dependable means of transportation in Paris, with the exception of the subway. And as taxi fare is so cheap, the average visitor prefers it to traveling in the congested subways, which, like most subways, usually do not have terminals or stations within the vicinity of the place you wish to visit. The Temple of Justice is visible for quite some distance before you arrive at it. It is a large, imposing building. Each corner of it is flanked with a tower-like turret so that it looks like a medieval castle. It apparently has never been cleaned by sandblasting, as are many of our old stone buildings in this country, for its walls are extremely black, as though they had been coated or painted with a black pigment. One gets a chill in looking at it, a sort of dread feeling. In the center of the square building between the two large turrets or towers is a great gateway, massive, composed of an iron grille. The bottom of the grille has spikes, and the whole gate itself is studded with bolts which are apparently hand-riveted. This Temple of Justice, as it is now called, was used during the French Revolution as the place where royalty was confined, where aristocrats were imprisoned before their trials, or as we might say, mock trials, and before they were led to the guillotine. As you approach the large gateway, you feel your spirits ebbing, whether it is the suggestion of the building itself, its cold atmosphere, or whether it is knowledge of the fact that thousands were confined there before they lost their lives through political upheaval. Many were tortured there, most all were led from there to their deaths. Political prisoners during the French Revolution who were led into that gateway knew it meant the end of freedom and the end of life. It was like crossing the threshold from this life to another. We passed through the gateway into the courtyard. The courtyard consisted of cobblestones irregularly laid and not even uniform in height. About this small quadrangle were the four walls of the structure, all of the same cold, appearing stone. One felt oppressed, as though it were even difficult to breathe, though of course the courtyard was open above. The only openings in the walls of the building were long, narrow apertures about 3 feet in length and perhaps 8 or 10 inches in width. Behind these apertures were little alcoves in which a man could stand and look out through the narrow slit, and shoot through it if necessary without exposing himself too greatly. If one looked up at these apertures, which were dark because of the shadows of the interior, one almost felt as if eyes were piercing him, as if he were being scanned by an invisible person. We quickly crossed the cobblestone courtyard to a low arched doorway typical of Gothic architecture. We stepped down 3 well-worn steps and pushed heavily against a plank door with its strap-iron braces, which creaked on its rusty hinges as it opened. We looked into what seemed to be an enormous subterranean chamber with a vaulted ceiling with many squatty columns of enormous circumference. These columns supported the entire structure in the manner of Gothic buildings. The columns were joined at their tops by arches forming a series of pockets or vaults in the ceiling. It was very dark, except for yellow light of a small gas jet. One could easily see that the gas light had been added some time later, for the pipe was strung along and fastened to the columns. The flame was flickering considerably because of the drafts that came down from this great underground area. We closed the door behind us, which left us alone in this great chamber. For no reason whatsoever, we spoke in hushed voices as though we were afraid of awakening someone or attracting attention to ourselves. Finally, realizing that there must be an attendant in the place, I called out. The echo of my voice seemed to spring back towards us from every corner as it resounded throughout the stone chamber. It was flung back at us from the vaulted ceiling, from the stone floor, from the many pillars. It was as though we had awakened 1,000 demons who were jeering at us. It was a startling effect. However, it had the desired result, for there approached us an attendant in a tattered uniform who, though he was there for that purpose and must have received visitors frequently, seemed rather curious because we were there. We explained the best way we could in rather crude and broken French what we desired, that we wanted to be shown about, particularly did we want to see the famous cell of Marie Antoinette. He motioned us to follow him, which we did, and we wended our way among the forest of massive columns to a circular stone staircase. At the bottom of the stone staircase was another heavy plank door with an enormous bolt and chain, crude but very substantial. In the upper center of the door was a grille or aperture about 10 inches square with 3 stout bars in it. They were so rusty that the metal was crystallizing or flaking away. Over the grille opening was the remains of a small shutter, so that apparently it could be closed so that the prisoner in the cell could not see out. This, the attendant explained, was the cell of the famous and beautiful Marie Antoinette. She was confined for quite some time before she was taken from the cell and led in a rough, high, wooden-wheeled cart through the streets of Paris, before the shouting, screaming throngs to the guillotine. There was her stone couch and the little shrine at which she prayed daily. The vibrations were intense, acute. We had engendered within us in that cell mingled feelings of fear, hatred, and of remorse. There in the cell also were big iron rings driven into the stones to which unruly prisoners could be chained. Then we were led to another cell, and still another, and finally again back into the great subterranean chamber, the dungeon-like vast hall. It was in this great chamber that the aristocrats, the ladies and gentlemen, the counts and the countesses, sat about playing cards, talking in low voices, weeping, consoling each other, praying, hoping, while several times a day the bolts and chains would rattle on the outer gate, and in would come officers of the citizens' guard who would read from a long scroll the names of those who were next to be tried in a court composed of the revolutionaries. When their names were read, shrieks would rend the stone chamber, for all knew that when they were led before the tribunal, they could expect no mercy and no justice, for there was no trial. They were all condemned to death, and it was just the formality of passing in review before the judges, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, and almost before the name of a defendant left the lips of the clerk of the court, a cry would arise from the court, "Guilty, the guillotine." There is a fascination about a gruesome place such as the Temple of Justice. One would imagine that he or she would be anxious to leave, flee from the place, seek the fresh air outdoors, or that even the rain would be welcome and refreshing. But instead you are drawn to investigate further. The horror of it seems to grip the mind, draw you on and on. We finally returned to our hotel, and Frater Brouwer and I prepared our photography equipment, for the next day was to be a busy one for us. The third day was in our favor, photographically speaking. The sun shone bright and the atmosphere was unusually clear of the customary smoke. We set out in search of the quarters of the famed Count Alessandro Cagliostro, prominent in the annals of the 18th century. We could not describe to our driver that we wanted to go to the former residence and garret laboratory of the renowned alchemist and mystic Cagliostro, for Cagliostro is not even known to the average Frenchman, except for those who have studied mysticism and philosophy and the history of that period thoroughly. So we had to give him the name of the rue or street. It was quite a drive. It took us approximately half an hour to reach there. We found ourselves in the heart of bustling, noisy Paris. It was a light wholesale district. The houses of the street were all 100 to 250 years old. Most of them had been converted into factories for manufacturing of fabrics. It was now strictly a commercial district. We immediately found the place we sought because of its unusual appearance. The building was recessed, surrounded by a high cement wall. On top of the cement wall, which was about 12 or 14 feet in height, was an iron railing. And back from that iron railing, we could see the upper 2 stories of the building. The garret story was quite eerie looking. It consisted of a series of superimposed windows that looked as though they were fastened or attached to the stone building and extended from the face of it. But what principally caught our attention and definitely identified it as the place we sought was the garret balcony. It was a little porch that extended out from the edge of the top story, and over this porch, which had a simple iron railing about it, was a low, narrow roof, and projecting from the edge of the roof was a metal bar about 4 feet in length from which hung a pulley, and from which dangled a strand of cable. It was from that balcony that Count Alessandro Cagliostro hoisted from the cobblestone courtyard below his kegs of chemicals and boxes of instruments used in his secret alchemical experiments. Cagliostro in his youth had gone to the Orient and studied in the mystery schools there, and became well versed in the secret laws of nature. Returning again to Europe, he became renowned as a healer. He effected miraculous cures. He seemed always to be in possession of great wealth, jewels and gems, and he was lavish in his contributions to the poor and needy. His demonstrations of natural law gained for him the reputation, on the one hand, of being an astute philosopher and alchemist, and on the other hand, he was accused by those who feared his powers of being a black magician and of practicing the arts of Satan. From where his tremendous wealth came, which seemed endless, no one quite knew. It was said that he had discovered the means of transmuting the baser metals into gold, and thus could make gold at will. Because of the great cures he effected, it was said that he had also found the elixir of life. Kings and potentates sought his counsel and his help, but as his fame spread, so did also jealousy and fear of him. It is said he entered Paris riding in a great gold coach laden with gems and with chests of gold. He was charged with many crimes and successfully defended himself against them. Some of his greatest accusers were those who held high positions in the church. The persecution became more intense, and finally he was dragged bodily from his garret home and wrongly imprisoned for life. For years, the only historical accounts were those which came down to us from prejudiced persons, declaring him to be a charlatan, a mountebank, a fraud, and an impostor. Since that time, other facts have been found which reveal that he was not a charlatan, not a fraud, but a true mystic, one who used his wealth for the benefit of others and most certainly had a mastery of natural law which he sought to teach, and which caused mingled feelings of respect and fear toward him. With these thoughts in mind, we entered the courtyard and looked about. Everything was disillusioning. Along the three sides of the courtyard were doorways that originally had perhaps led into private chambers of his residence. Now they were doorways leading into shops, and over the doorways hung either brass or wooden signs. And through some of the partly open doors we could see women working at sewing machines manufacturing garments. From some of the windows overhead, wearing apparel was hanging and modern household utensils were evident. There seemed to be no appreciation of the fact that they were living in what was at one time the center of the greatest mystery of Europe, the residence and the garret laboratory of Cagliostro, the man who held the respect, fear, and admiration of the crowned heads of Europe. Most of them did not even know that this old building had been the property of Cagliostro. As we stood looking about, a man approached us from one of the shops. He appeared to be the superintendent and asked us what place we wished. We explained that we were merely visitors and desired to take a few photographs. He seemed puzzled as to why we wished to photograph these small places of business or shops. We explained that we were here because of its historical interest, that we knew in fact that this was the former residence of the mystic and alchemist Cagliostro. He looked quizzically at us for a moment and replied that it was, but that no one except himself and one other of the attendants knew anything about it, and they said nothing about it as they did not want to attract visitors who would interfere with the business activities. He said we could not enter the garret because it was occupied by a tailoring establishment, and the tailor himself had never heard of Cagliostro and did not, of course, know that he was occupying the laboratory of the alchemist. It seemed such a travesty that nothing was done to respect the memory of this character. At least we thought a brass plate could have been erected to his memory somewhere in the courtyard. I had known from my studies and from our Rosicrucian archives that there was a secret passageway and stairway which led to the garret, and that the passageway also led out from this court for several blocks to some other residence in the city that Cagliostro would use when desiring to evade the curious throngs who used to collect about the outer wall, either waiting to see him or to solicit his gold. My attention was attracted to one of the doors in the corner of the courtyard. It was a little smaller than the rest, but particularly was it noticeable because it was not wooden like the others, but was all metal, a solid sheet of metal. It looked like a fire exit, such as we use in buildings today, with a metal door to prevent the spread of fire from one building to another. I pointed to it. "And that?" I said. He seemed to sense what I thought, and he said, "That is not in use any longer. It used to be a tunnel or passageway that led out somewhere into this district, but long ago a portion of it caved in, and so it has fallen into disuse. And we keep the iron doorway closed so that it will not be used by anyone, thus they will not be injured." "Cagliostro's?" I asked. He replied, "Most likely, as no one remembers when it was constructed, and apparently it was made at the time this building was erected several centuries ago." We had all the information we needed, and we immediately took photographs. See photograph in the January 1937 issue of the Rosicrucian Digest. On the final afternoon of our stay in Paris, I met Mademoiselle Guesdon at a prearranged time. She accompanied me to an appointment with Frater B, Sovereign Grand Master of the Order of M, into which I had been duly initiated in Brussels. Frater B holds a prominent position in France. He is Secretary of the Archives of the French government, a department containing the records, manuscripts, books and papers, and documents of state, a most responsible and important position. The Library of Archives is located in the Chamber of Deputies building in Paris, an historical place, once a palace. After a short ride, we arrived at the Chamber of Deputies, and Mademoiselle Guesdon and myself were escorted into the private office of Frater B. Frater B is a very dynamic and forceful man, a man of approximately 50 years of age, but with the vitality, stamina, and energy of a much younger man. He speaks quickly, he acts quickly, he thinks quickly. Life holds two principal interests for him besides his family: his work, the responsible position he has in the French government, and his mystical philosophical studies and office in the Fudosi and the Order of M. Our exchange of ideas was a little difficult as Frater B spoke no English and I no French. So again, Mademoiselle Gesden came to my aid. We discussed at length the work of the AMORC in America and the work of the Order of M in Europe. Frater B explained that he had conferred upon the Imperator of the Rosicrucian Order of AMORC certain authority to establish in North and South America the Order of M, and that before I left France, I too would receive authority to assist the Imperator in the establishment of this order. Seeing my great interest in the Chamber of Deputies because of its historical significance, and because it is one of the important departments of the French government, he personally escorted me throughout the old building into what formerly were the ballrooms and library and music rooms of the royalty that occupied it before the Revolution. Then he took me into one of the alcoves of the archives, and there were great bound volumes, scrolls, manuscripts dating back for centuries. Many of these volumes and manuscripts are priceless because of their historical value. For example, he showed me the handwritten court record of the trial of Marie Antoinette, whose cell we had visited but 2 days before. He pointed out in this old manuscript how every time any defense was raised in her behalf, the jurists would cry out, "Guillotine, guillotine," and there in black and white appears this blemish on justice. It was a strange sensation to look upon such a manuscript and to visualize the scene that took place when these events were recorded. Things of the greatest historical importance seem commonplace to Europeans, for there they have so much that is of the past, surrounded with history. Any one of the things would demand considerable attention in our new America. The very chair which Frater B used as his personal office chair was an antique that would gladden the heart of any dealer in America or elsewhere, and would have brought an enormous sum. It was a chair that came from the private library of King Louis VIII of France, yet Frater B was using it as just another office chair, and he smiled at my amazement at his commonplace acceptance of this antique. When we finally left, it was dusk, and we were caught in the throngs returning to home from work. The jostling, pushing, scurrying crowds at 6 p.m. in Paris are no different in their anxiety to return home after routine affairs and enjoy their firesides and their personal interest than the office and workaday crowds one finds in any city in America or Canada or elsewhere. This night we could not enjoy strolling along Parisian boulevards, up the Rue de Rivoli or along the Madeleine, nor could we sit at the Café de la Paix, where it is said, "The world passes by," and which it is also said is the most cosmopolitan spot in Europe, for we had to pack and prepare for a long journey. We were truly to start eastward on the morrow. Egypt was beckoning. Our trek along the trail of civilization was to begin in earnest. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.